After almost a decade since Disney bought Star Wars, we finally got that Obi-Wan Kenobi story. Lucasfilm announced early on in their Star Wars tenure that they would be doing spin-off movies, the first two being Rogue One and a Han Solo movie. With Ewan McGregor still relatively young and enthusiastic about the Obi-Wan Kenobi character and the Star Wars franchise, the fans got to work. We clamored for an Obi-Wan Kenobi movie for years. Even after the divisive nature of The Last Jedi, most Star Wars fans still agreed we wanted to see Ewan back as Obi-Wan Kenobi. On numerous occasions, there were strong rumors from reliable sources that this movie was going to happen. In 2018, after Solo: A Star Wars Story bombed at the box office, talks about the Obi-Wan Kenobi movie seemed to die down, and there was less hope that Lucasfilm would pull the trigger. However, things started to change in 2019 when the Walt Disney Company announced they were creating their own streaming service titled Disney+. And with the announcement of a series titled The Mandalorian and another series about Cassian Andor from Rogue One, it appeared that the Obi-Wan Kenobi movie would now become a TV series. And in late 2019, Star Wars fans had their prayers answered.
Are you going to play Obi-Wan Kenobi again?
Yes.
Ewan McGregor was back, but details on the series were limited. It wasn't until a year and a half later where at the 2020 Disney Showcase where we got more details. Deborah Chow was attached to the project as lead director, along with some confirmed castings. What really shook the fandom, however, was that we would be seeing Hayden Christensen reprise his role as Darth Vader. While some Star Wars fans had their concerns that Obi-Wan and Vader would now meet again after the events of Revenge of the Sith and before A New Hope, most Star Wars fans were ecstatic to see Hayden return to this role. And about a year and a half after that announcement, almost 3 years after the series was first announced, and around 10 years since Disney bought the franchise, all 6 episodes of the Obi-Wan Kenobi series have been released. So this begs the question, how did the series turn out? Did the show live up to the expectations that Star Wars fans have built up for the past 10 years? Did the show warrant the return of Ewan McGregor and Hayden Christensen? Did the show honor the characters and the themes that George Lucas created? Would Darth Vader continue his hatred of sand? Hello everybody and welcome to another video. My name is The Goldman and today we are going to talk about Obi-Wan Kenobi 1 year later. Part 1. Did we need this story? Whenever a new story in a franchise comes out, people love to ask the question, was this story necessary? Did we need to see this story being told? And I cannot tell you how much I hate this question. There has never been a story that was necessary or needed to happen. After A New Hope came out, The Empire Strikes Back was not a necessary story. After the originals came out, the prequels were not necessary stories. When Disney bought Star Wars, the sequels and spin-offs were not necessary stories. There are only 2 reasons why a story is ever told on the big screen. One is that the company funding the project is hoping to make profit off the movie or show, and 2, that a storyteller has a story that they want to tell. A good movie or show usually has a healthy balance between these 2. Now, I would argue that some stories warrant being told over other stories. For example, I think a story about what really happened the night Kylo Ren destroyed Luke's temple is far more interesting than a story of Kit Fisto going on an adventure. So when it comes to stories I feel are warranted outside of the 9 Skywalker saga films, an Obi-Wan Kenobi story after Revenge of the Sith is at the top of that list. For one, the story potential there is immense. Obi-Wan lost everything after Revenge of the Sith. His Jedi family, his Jedi life, all of his friends, and most importantly, his apprentice turned brother. In Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope, we don't really get a good sense of how Obi-Wan dealt with all of that. Sure, he makes comments about Anakin turning to the dark side, but how did he cope with all of that loss? How did going from being a Jedi to living as a desert hermit for 19 years affect his mental health? How did he learn to trust himself again after failing his apprentice in the worst way possible? How did he feel when he learned Anakin survived his burning on Mustafar? These are all fascinating questions to me. And some of you will say you assumed that Obi-Wan knew Anakin was still alive, but I disagree with that. If Obi-Wan knew Anakin would survive their duel, then what he did did was cruel to let Anakin burn alive. So I feel these questions warrant telling this story. The other question that is often addressed is that should Darth Vader have been in this story? I would agree this is not a necessary component to an Obi-Wan focused story. You could tell a story of Obi-Wan doing stuff on Tatooine and Vader doesn't need to show up. But I would argue that what happened to Anakin is necessary for an Obi-Wan story. This was Obi-Wan's greatest failure, and that failure resulted in the rise of the Sith and the rise of the Empire. It would be a great missed opportunity if there was an Obi-Wan story and how he coped with his failures was not addressed. So overall, of course an Obi-Wan Kenobi story was not necessary, but damn, the concept is so intriguing, and this story warrants being told far more than any other story Lucasfilm could tell right now. Part 2. World building and cinematography. One could argue that world building and cinematography are two completely different entities of a show. World building is about creating the world of a fantasy universe and allowing the viewer to easily consume themselves in that universe. Cinematography is about the visuals on the screen and how well they are conveyed and what emotions they're supposed to invoke in the audience. So yes, these two are entirely different, but it's in the DNA of Star Wars that these two go hand in hand. World building can be simply done if a character is talking for 10 minutes, but it's not good world building if we can't actually see those ideas on the screen. Now, this isn't the case with all world building, but most of it isn't done with words coming out of a mouth, but by the visuals on the screen. And the world that is being built in a franchise means nothing if the viewers don't get to witness it in an elegant manner. Are the worlds visually pleasing to the eye? Do the colors convey the tone that the storyteller is going for? Is the geography of the scene well established so the viewer has a clear understanding of where certain locations are in relation to other places? So this is all crucial to Star Wars, and the mastery of both the world building and the cinematography are what made the original Star Wars films so successful. So how was the world building and cinematography in Obi-Wan Kenobi? When it comes to the world building, luckily this show didn't have to do much. We already know where Obi-Wan is and why he's there. Tatooine has been featured in Star Wars more than any other planet, and the previous movies already explain why Obi-Wan is on this planet. With the Empire, we already know the gist of what they are and how they operate and what Darth Vader's role is in it. So already two of the most important aspects of world building have already been done in previous stories. One could argue that the Inquisitors should have been in this conversation because we've seen them in Rebels and Jedi Fallen Order. So while the building blocks are there for the Inquisitors, the story still needs to do a good job conveying them to the audience, because you can't rely on the vast majority of the audience having watched an animated show or played a video game. With that being said, I feel the Inquisitors were translated well into the show. We get the gist that the job of the Inquisitors is to hunt down remaining Jedi. They serve under Darth Vader and follow his every command. There is a Grand Inquisitor who is in charge of the other Inquisitors, and each of the Inquisitors has a number designation along with brother or sister depending on their gender. So establishing what the Inquisitors are wasn't that hard, but they did it well. When it comes to the physical locations of the series, I wasn't too impressed. Fortress Inquisitorius was well translated from Fallen Order to here. Daiyu was the planet in the second episode, and I felt it was done well. It had its own unique feel, and it actually felt like a real lived-in place. But besides that, all the other new worlds introduced in the show were incredibly dull. Mapuzo is literally just a grassy field with a small town. We don't even get a good vibe of what Jabim is like because we only see the inside of the base. I guess it's just a rocky sand planet like Geonosis. And the unnamed planet of the final battle between Vader and Obi-Wan was just another rocky desert planet. I guess this was the first time we really got to see Alderaan, and that was cool. But all the planets that were done well were planets we've seen before. And the new planets besides Daiyu were bland and didn't add anything to the Star Wars lore. Moving on to the cinematography, the series also struggled here. What's strange is that the effects are fairly well done. I don't feel like at any point when I was watching this series, I was able to notice bad CGI, but the way a lot of this was filmed was uninventive and bland. Tatooine was shot beautifully in the first episode, but other than that, I wasn't impressed. It was a rarity in this show that you get to see wide angles or establishing shots of certain locations. Most of the show is filmed in medium shots. Now, you could argue that this was intentional because this show is supposed to feel more grounded, but throughout this 6-episode series, we travel to 9 9 planets, and only Tatooine, Alderaan, and Mustafar are well filmed, and we spent almost no time on Mustafar. Star Wars has always been known for having these worlds that suck you in, but none of these new planets are going to be memorable to me, and I feel the big reason why is because of the way they were shot. Yes, there were a few shots here and there that were great, but overall I was unimpressed. Some of you will say that since this is a series, it won't get the same budget as a movie, therefore it won't look as nice. And while this is true, I've seen plenty of other shows with a similar budget do a far better job at its cinematography. So to summarize my overall thoughts on world building and cinematography, it wasn't awful, but there was a lot to be desired. Before I continue on with the rest of this video, only 5.4% of my viewers are subscribed to this channel. So if you're enjoying this video, please consider subscribing for more content like this. Thank you. Part 3, Obi-Wan Kenobi. It's time to focus now on the most important parts of the show, and that is the characters and their stories. Everything else about a show can be a 10 out of 10 perfect, but if the stories of the characters are poor and the characters aren't well written, then the entire show collapses. So let's take a look at Obi-Wan and his story. To start things off with episode 1, I felt that episode was criminally underrated. There are so many aspects of this episode that perfectly illustrate Obi-Wan and his depression, especially in his first scene. We see this one man getting paid unfairly and treated poorly. A Jedi is supposed to stand up for those who cannot fight for themselves. Obi-Wan looks like he's about to do that, but then decides to do nothing about it. Right away, we can tell that this is not the same Obi-Wan. He appears to repeat the same daily tasks over and over again. He goes to work, takes the transport into town, saves some meat for his trusty friend, and then goes home where he has nightmares about his past. I love this scene where we as the audience get to see what he is dreaming about and how it keeps him up at night. I've made this comparison already on a few videos, but I can't help but bring it again here. In The Mandalorian, Bill Burr's character talks about how if you can sleep well at night, you're doing better than most.
As far as I'm concerned, if you can make it through your day and still sleep at night, you're doing better than most.
What he means by this is that if you don't have any guilt, regrets, or fears that keep you up at night, then you have it all right. With Obi-Wan, we see that he is not sleeping well at night. His past keeps him up, and it haunts him. This moment is fantastic because it shows us the mental state he is in. He has deep regrets about his life. He feels he failed Anakin, and it continues to haunt him all these years later. Multiple times in this episode, we can just tell that Obi-Wan is mentally weak and has lost all the fight he has in him. As I mentioned before, not standing up for that one guy was something old Obi-Wan wouldn't do. When the Jawa shows up later on, Obi-Wan tells us he is aware that the Jawas steal from him and sell him his stuff back, but he doesn't really seem to care all that much. Obi-Wan is completely hopeless. He doesn't care if people are abusing or taking advantage of him. Helpguide.org states that the top signs of depression are feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, a bleak outlook. Nothing will ever get better, and there is nothing you can do to improve your situation. This perfectly describes Obi-Wan to begin this series. This is further exemplified when Nari, the young Jedi, shows up. He talks about how he can train with Obi-Wan and help him rebuild the Order. Obi-Wan right away crushes his hopes and tells him to bury his lightsaber in the sand and hide for the rest of his life. He even straight up states that the time of the Jedi is over. This line actually says a lot more about his mental state than you might think. Remember, he's been entrusted in raising Luke and potentially training him one day. Even though Obi-Wan still keeps an eye on young Luke, he seems hopeless that Luke will ever be able to change anything. Nari basically states exactly what this story is about. He says, "What happened to you? You were once a great Jedi." It's hard to be a great Jedi when you are riddled with guilt and fear. When Bail Organa reaches out to him about Leia being captured, Obi-Wan rejects the call. He does not trust in himself that he can save Leia. And when Bail actually arrives on Tatooine, Obi-Wan admits to all of his fears. And this is what establishes the beginning of his character arc. This series as a whole is really about overcoming trauma and how different human beings go about that. Obi-Wan's trauma has resulted in him being severely depressed. Obi-Wan rejects Bail's initial call because he's scared of going back out there. He doesn't trust in himself and he's scared he'll fail someone again. I've seen some people talk about how this story is another example of Star Wars making a character depressed and turning them into a coward. In the case of The Last Jedi, I understand why most people would be be upset with not seeing a more positive Luke, because the storytellers did not need to go down that route. They had a chance to tell any story, and they told the story of deconstructing Luke and building him back up again. But with Obi-Wan, I don't know what else you would expect from someone who went through what Obi-Wan went through. Any human being would be fairly depressed had they been in his shoes. I'm baffled that so many people want Obi-Wan to be this hopeful man through all 19 years of his time on Tatooine and have him not go through any mental challenges. Anyway, Bail manages to convince him to leave, and Obi-Wan agrees to go on this adventure. This first episode, when it comes to Obi-Wan's story, I feel was absolutely perfect. It illustrates where his mental state is, it explains what his fears are, and we get a good understanding of how he will change when the series concludes. Obi-Wan doesn't really begin to change until the 4th episode, but we still get a few more building blocks in the 2nd and 3rd episode when it comes to his character. The whole point of these 2 episodes, I believe, were to show the contrast between an old, grumpy Obi-Wan and a young, naive, optimistic Leia. Narratively, Leia's purpose is to shine some light back into Obi-Wan. There are some great moments between these two in these 2 episodes, but the one that stands out to me is when Obi-Wan tries to comfort her. After Leia tells him her droid is dead, at first he says, "Good, now stay quiet." There's a moment of reflection afterwards where he realizes that he is talking to a kid and then tries to comfort her. He asks what happened and shows interest in her. Conversations like these matter a lot to a 10-year-old. So this moment here was a subtle way to show Obi-Wan is lightening up a bit. There's another part of Obi-Wan's arc that is introduced in this episode, and that is Obi-Wan's ability to trust people. We meet Haja, who Obi-Wan seems to initially dislike. When Haja tells Obi-Wan to rendezvous at a certain point, he reluctantly agrees. But when they inevitably get there in the 3rd episode, he instantly regrets it and said he shouldn't have trusted Haja. This pays off in the last episode, but I'll get there in a bit. The other part of the story that was relatively done well was Obi-Wan reflecting on Padme. There's 2 occasions where Obi-Wan talks about how Leia reminds him of Padme. Narratively, the purpose of these moments were to instill hope back into Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan knows how great of a woman Padme was, and if there is a chance that Leia will turn into Padme, then the galaxy will be okay. Throughout this series, Obi-Wan slowly starts to remind himself who he's fighting for, which allows him to maintain hope in his purpose. The last important moment for Obi-Wan was finding out Anakin was still alive. It's already discussed why I think it makes sense that Obi-Wan thought Anakin was dead, so I'm not going to talk about it again here. Even though I love Ewan's acting here when he learns Anakin is alive from Reva, I can't help but feel this moment was misplaced. What I believe would have been far more powerful is if Obi-Wan found out Anakin was alive in Chapter 3 when Vader is strolling through town. Obi-Wan has this moment where he senses Vader and then decides to run off somewhere. Imagine if this was the moment where Obi-Wan found out. Then he starts freaking out and he needs to leave Leia because he must find out if that is really Anakin. And then when they start to fight, Obi-Wan experiences the horror of learning what Anakin had become. But as it currently is constructed, the only benefit of having Obi-Wan find out earlier is that one scene where Obi-Wan sees Anakin in the distance. But that didn't really add anything to the show. It also gives Obi-Wan a better reason to go confront Vader. As it currently stands, I don't know why Obi-Wan couldn't just run away with Leia to the spaceport. Did he fear that Vader would sense him and then potentially endanger Leia? I guess that makes sense, but it wasn't all that clear. Either way, I love how outmatched Obi-Wan is during this first duel. This fight really isn't a reflection on Obi-Wan's mental health, but a reflection on how much he lost in touch with his Jedi ways. Obi-Wan looks like he shat his pants the first time he saw Vader with a lightsaber, and then he spends the rest of the fight just running away from Vader. Obi-Wan proceeds to get burned, and now we are in the 2nd half of the series. In chapters 4 and 5, there aren't many good moments with Obi-Wan. Chapter 4 was an awful episode, mostly because we learned absolutely nothing about Obi-Wan. The only thing that this episode adds to Obi-Wan's story is how he progressively starts to get more comfortable with the Force and his lightsaber again. But again, it doesn't really add much to Obi-Wan's story. In chapter 5, we start to see the Obi-Wan of old again. He acts like a leader, which he wouldn't have done in the first episode, and he essentially risks his life to have a conversation with Reva. The highlight of this episode for a lot of people was the flashbacks with him and Anakin training. While it was cool to see these flashbacks, they don't really add anything to Obi-Wan's story other than that he knows the flaws of Anakin. Chapter 5, while still a pretty good episode, doesn't do much for Obi-Wan's story other than him slowly transitioning back into the man he was before. The last episode was fantastic for Obi-Wan's story. This episode accomplishes 2 things. Firstly, he completes his character arc and returns to the man he was before. And secondly, he is able to talk to Vader again. The episode begins with him realizing he needs to leave the transport if they're all going to be safe. This is a standard thing for a Jedi to do, but seeing Obi-Wan do it after where he was in the beginning of the series is important. He also asks Haja to return Leia to Alderaan. This completes the part of his arc where he learns to trust in others again. Earlier he talks about how he shouldn't have trusted Haja, but here he entrusts with Haja the most important thing to Obi-Wan right now, and that's saving Leia. So this was a mini arc that I appreciated. Obi-Wan proceeds to go down to this planet where he's ready to fight Vader again. Just through his body language, you can tell he's a different person than he was a few episodes before. He's not scared of Vader anymore. He's facing him straight on with his chest up. Obi-Wan is ready. The two start fighting, and unlike before, they are on even footing. I really liked this fight. I thought it was shot and executed well. The moment where Obi-Wan was buried in the ground was a bit odd. He's struggling to hold up the rocks, but when he starts to think about Leia, it gives him the strength to push through. I don't get the purpose of this moment here. Was it just to add tension? It doesn't really take away from Obi-Wan's arc, but it doesn't really add anything into it either. We already know that Obi-Wan is motivated to save Leia and Luke. I guess you can argue that this makes him fight from a more defensive perspective since he's defending Luke and Leia more so than attacking Vader, but it was a fine moment, I guess. Obi-Wan reaches Vader again and he proceeds to kick Vader's ass. He chucks a mountain of rocks at him, repeatedly smashes Vader's breathing device thingy, and then makes a crack in his helmet similar to what Ahsoka did. Now, of course, a lot of people are going to compare this to Star Wars Rebels, as they should. From a purely visual level, these moments play out almost identically, but there's a key difference between Ahsoka's story and Obi-Wan's story. Ahsoka found out that Anakin was not only alive, but was also Darth Vader a few days prior to their fight. Anakin's fall to the dark side hasn't been on her mind for the past 15 years. Ahsoka was able to live her life and make a difference by joining the rebellion. Ahsoka is definitely moved by fighting Vader, and she apologizes for leaving Anakin in season 5 of the Clone Wars, but this moment here isn't an emotional catharsis for Ahsoka. She isn't overcoming any demons here by confronting Vader. Her life hasn't been on pause because of the birth of Darth Vader. With Obi-Wan, it is the complete opposite. Not only is Obi-Wan aware that his former brother turned to the dark side, but he blames himself. As we saw in chapter 1, he has been a broken man for the past 10 years. This Ben Kenobi was only a shell of the General Kenobi from the Clone Wars. Obi-Wan holds immense guilt from the events of Revenge of the Sith, so confronting Vader is something he has to do. When he sees half of the face of his former apprentice, one last time he tries to have a conversation with Anakin. He breaks down in tears and apologizes for everything. Even though Vader doesn't really accept the apology, I think people don't understand the therapeutic importance that a simple apology can have. There are countless stories of people with immense guilt, and the only way they can move on is by confronting those they hurt and apologizing. Scenarios that really damage people mentally are where a person passes away and that leaves another person with things unsaid that will never be said. For the better part of a decade, Obi-Wan felt immense guilt for failing Anakin, and he was never able to apologize. But now he realizes Anakin is alive and he has a chance to do so. He apologizes and is now finally ready to move on with his life. He says goodbye, Darth, coming to terms with the fact that Anakin is more machine now than man, twisted and evil. One could argue that this is the thematic and emotional climax of the show. Obi-Wan in a way has overcome his guilt and is ready to move on. He turns back to Tatooine and has a deep conversation with Reva. I'm going to touch on this a bit more later on when I talk about Reva, but this moment here is just another example of Obi-Wan returning to his Jedi roots. Instead of fighting Reva, he helps her feel better about her past and her decisions. He reminds her that she is free now and she can make better life decisions going forward. This series ends by showing us 3 different scenes where Obi-Wan is a hopeful, optimistic Jedi again. He says bye to Leia and tells her all the wonderful qualities she has from her parents. He makes sure Owen and Luke are safe, and I can't believe they did it, but they managed to get Obi-Wan to say hello there with it actually tying into his arc. It's a reminder that he's back to his old self. And then the show concludes with him talking to Qui-Gon again. This whole time he wasn't able to talk to Qui-Gon because he lost his Jedi way, and when he found it again, he was able to talk to him. Overall, when it comes to Obi-Wan and his arc specifically, it was everything I could have asked for. There are certain moments I felt could have been executed far better, but the broad strokes of it were all perfect. This, at the end of the day, was the most important aspect of the show, and they nailed it. The show began with Obi-Wan as a depressed man struggling with trauma, and he goes on a journey where he finds himself again and learns to overcome his mistakes. Obi-Wan's story was almost perfect to me, and I couldn't be happier. Part 4, Darth Vader. Let's take a look at Darth Vader. One thing I absolutely love about Vader's portrayal in this series is how well they blended the characters of Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader. Obviously, I know these two are the same person, but never have these two characters felt like the same person. Anytime I see Darth Vader on screen, I have a tough time in my mind imagining that this person in black armor is the same person as the main character of the prequels. Sure, I get that the point is that Anakin became a completely different person, but human beings just don't change everything about them like that. This series was really the first time I was able to connect these two and say that Darth Vader is an evil Anakin Skywalker. And no, it wasn't because I was able to see Hayden Christensen's face in the Darth Vader suit, although that did help. It was the actions of Vader and the way he presented himself that bridged that gap for me. Anakin was obviously always reckless, thinking with his heart before his mind. Anakin was also always an emotional character, but when it came to Vader, at least in the original trilogy, he was a man without emotion. He rarely showed any rage, and if he did, it was done quietly. We see him yell once in A New Hope, but besides that, Vader always seemed calm and collected. When someone wronged him, he simply killed them without a sweat, and he didn't make a big deal out of it. So the way this series blends Vader and Anakin is by making Vader a bit more emotional in this series. During Vader and Obi-Wan's first encounter in episode 3, you can tell Vader is tuning into his rage far more than he did in their encounter in A New Hope. When Vader says, "I am what you made me," that to me feels like something Anakin would say more so than Darth Vader, and I like that. But what really connects Anakin and Vader for me are the emotional decisions Vader makes. Whenever Vader makes a decision in prior stories, it always appears to be the right logical decision. He doesn't let his emotions get to him. And by the way, this is all prior to Return of the Jedi. I'm talking about non-conflicted Vader. Twice in this series does Vader make decisions purely based on emotions and not logic. The first offense was his first duel with Obi-Wan. After he clearly has him beat, he wants Obi-Wan to burn and suffer. He doesn't want to kill him right away. And in an attempt to try and drag Obi-Wan's torture out, Obi-Wan is able to escape Vader's grasp. The second time was in the final episode, when Vader tells his crew to ignore the fleeing ship and focus all the attention on Obi-Wan. This is again an emotional decision that backfired. They tie in all this with the flashbacks in Chapter 5. We see how Anakin is a far better duelist than Obi-Wan, but it's Anakin's need to prove himself that is his undoing. It was all about winning to Anakin, and we see that translated to Vader here. All of this tied together brilliantly for me and provided a rather fresh take on the character that fell in line with both Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader from the original trilogy. But moving on, how was Vader's presence tied into the story? As I stated earlier, this show is all about how people deal with trauma. While the main focus of this theme is on Obi-Wan and Reva, we do see how Darth Vader dealt with it, and that was through pure rage. Once Obi-Wan shows back up, Darth Vader is a lot more hostile than we are used to seeing him, and that is because Obi-Wan has enough rent in Vader's head to rebuild the Soviet Union. We don't really get an arc here for Vader, and we shouldn't. Vader should not change in this series at all. So this begs the question, should Vader have been in this series? I understand where some of you are coming from when you say you are done with the Skywalkers and you want to just focus on Obi-Wan Kenobi, but I fundamentally disagree. The main reason why is because of one specific line in Return of the Jedi. When Luke tells Vader there is good in him, Vader says, "Obi-Wan once thought as you do." Prior to this series, this is simply not true. During their encounter on Mustafar, not once does Obi-Wan reach out to Anakin and convince him to come back to the light. The way he yells at Anakin throughout that scene appears to me to be more of expressing anger and sadness instead of pleas to Anakin. So going into this series, one of the few things I desperately wanted was to see Obi-Wan reach out to Anakin, only to come to the conclusion that Anakin is dead. And this happens. When Obi-Wan says he's sorry, it's his final attempt to speak to Anakin. And when Vader says Anakin is gone and that he killed him, then Obi-Wan believes there is no light anymore, and he leaves. And the last scene from Vader was great. Vader tells Palpatine that he will continue the search for Obi-Wan, and Palpatine basically gives a vague threat. He says, if you can't get over your feelings towards your old master, then I will replace you with someone else. These kinds of threats are what make the Sith so incredibly interesting. Although Obi-Wan being alive would continue to make Vader angry, which would would only feed the dark side. So from my perspective, it makes more sense that Palpatine would encourage Vader to keep searching for Obi-Wan, but that's not a big deal. Overall, the main things I wanted from Vader in this series I got. So for the most part, I was strongly pleased with Vader in the series, but that doesn't excuse the problems that I had. Throughout this series, Vader makes numerous questionable decisions that I don't understand. To start off with the minor one I had, I am baffled that Vader didn't make a stronger effort to reach Obi-Wan again after that fire showed up. Vader easily could have walked around the fire or simply jumped over it. So that kind of bothered me, but again, this is the problem that frustrates me the least. You could argue this one was more of a narrative decision than Vader making questionable decisions, but his absence from the majority of Chapter 4 is baffling to me. Why he wouldn't go to Fortress Inquisitorius to talk to this child that Obi-Wan was protecting is strange. Vader more so than anyone should be the one interrogating Leia, not Reva. You could argue that Vader was doing something else, but that is never made clear in this episode. Vader would never skip out on an opportunity to gain more information about Obi-Wan, so him skipping out on interrogating Leia is, again, it's baffling. And lastly, the other glaring problem I had is with Chapter 5. I don't understand why Vader would let Reva take charge of this siege. For one, it is made clear that Vader suspected that Reva would turn her back against him. This is why he made her Grand Inquisitor, even though the current Grand Inquisitor is still alive. So what did Vader think Reva would accomplish that he himself couldn't do? Did he think Reva could lure out Obi-Wan? She technically did, but Reva let him go back inside the base, which only confirms that Vader was right about Reva's true intentions. Had Vader gone down to the planet himself, then Obi-Wan and company would still be trapped inside, and maybe Vader could have been able to storm the hangar quick enough to prevent the transport from leaving. So again, I don't understand why he would let Reva go on her own. Also, when he's fighting Reva and he beats her, it is incredibly dumb that Vader wouldn't kill Reva. You could argue that he thought Reva would die from being stabbed in the abdomen, but even then it seems so unlike Vader to just stab someone and let them bleed out. Vader seems like the type of guy to cut someone's head off or choke them until they stop moving. So again, this is another instance of Vader making questionable decisions. Even though I have a few problems with certain decisions Vader makes throughout this series, the actual character work that was done here was fantastic to me, especially the final goodbye where Vader says he killed Anakin. That moment is one of my all-time favorite Vader moments. Part 5, Reva. It's now time to address the most controversial aspect of this episode, and that's Reva. The major complaint that most people seem to have with Reva is that her story feels misplaced. This is a series about Obi-Wan Kenobi, and a lot of people are not interested in seeing another character get so much development. Yeah, sure, a lot of people simply don't like the character, but at least from my observation, most people would have been okay with Reva if her story was in a different show. Now, how do I feel about Reva? I'm kinda in the middle. Simply looking at her narrative, I find it to be satisfactory. The theme of the series is about how people respond to trauma, and the way Reva chose to go about this is through revenge. We basically learn that she's kinda an undercover Inquisitor just trying to kill Vader. Throughout the series, she tunes more into the dark side, where in the climax of her arc, she realizes she's becoming the very thing she wants to destroy, and she stops herself from killing Luke. That arc I really liked. The way Lucasfilm handles characters dealing with trauma mostly have worked for me, and Reva's arc about becoming the very thing she swore to destroy and stopping herself before it was too late is in line with the themes of Star Wars. The major problem with her story is its relationship to Obi-Wan. Since this show is called Obi-Wan Kenobi, everything about the show should center around Obi-Wan. Now, of course, other characters are allowed to get development. Most superhero movies are named after one individual, but other characters still get arcs. The problem with Reva is not the fact that she has an arc, it's that it's mostly removed from Obi-Wan's story. If you completely cut out the Reva story after episode 4, then Obi-Wan's story doesn't change at all. Nothing in Reva's arc affects Obi-Wan in any way. The only connection that Obi-Wan has to Reva's arc is when in their last scene together, Obi-Wan comforts her and shows her his newfound Jedi spirit. But one simple scene that isn't too important to the main character character doesn't justify an entire character arc for another character. What should have happened was one of two things. One could have been that Obi-Wan makes a significant character change because of what he sees in Reva. I don't know how this would happen, but somehow Reva would help Obi-Wan go through his arc, and if it weren't for her, he wouldn't have returned to his Jedi ways. Now, that would probably piss off a lot of people, but at least it makes Reva's presence in the story warranted. The other thing that could have happened, and this is the direction I would have preferred, is that Reva undergoes her arc because of Obi-Wan. Say Obi-Wan goes on his exact arc where he overcomes his trauma. Because of his newfound knowledge, he is able to help Reva overcome her revenge quest. Obi-Wan should have been the main reason why Reva doesn't kill Luke. This way, had Obi-Wan never gone on his arc in the series, then he wouldn't have been able to convince Reva not to kill Luke. So while I do appreciate what the storytellers were trying to do with Reva, the major problem with her story is that it's too isolated from Obi-Wan's story, and that's a problem in a show called Obi-Wan Kenobi. Part 6. Princess Leia. Leia's inclusion in this story is the one that is the most interesting to me. She doesn't have an arc in this series. Her role is to help Obi-Wan undergo his arc. Right off the bat, I have to say that I love the way this character was written. This is the first time that Star Wars has taken a character we know and love and then tell a new story with them as a 10-year-old kid. And yes, they also did that with Anakin, but since 10-year-old Anakin is completely different from Darth Vader, Lucas didn't have to make an effort to make sure 10-year-old Annie resembled his older self. With Leia, they need to make this character feel like Princess Leia, or her inclusion in this story falls apart. I can gladly say they nailed Leia perfectly. Everything that Leia does in this series is exactly how I would picture a 10-year-old Leia doing it. My favorite Leia scene is in the first episode, and it's the moment where she talks to her douchebag cousin. He makes a comment about Leia being adopted, and the way Leia responded felt exactly like Leia to me. Leia is one tough cookie. She isn't gonna run away crying because someone insulted her. So her clapback where she roasted the shit out of him was great. But Leia is also a human being. She can get her feelings hurt too. So seeing the comments still bother her but not change who she is what I thought was perfect. And of course, throughout the season, we get plenty of moments where she gets to shine and we get to see her take charge attitude. So when it comes to how this character was portrayed, I thought it was perfect. Now when it comes to her story, I'm kinda 50-50 on it. I feel it was really smart to use her as the reason why Obi-Wan leaves Tatooine. Leia is just as important as Luke, so it makes sense that Obi-Wan would leave Tatooine for a bit to go rescue her. And in the third and fourth episode, I absolutely love the dynamic between her and Obi-Wan and how it makes Obi-Wan grow. Now when it comes to the second half of the season, it seems like the writers just didn't know what to use her for anymore. They decided to devote another whole episode to her getting captured and rescued, which was completely unnecessary. And in the last two episodes, she didn't really do anything. Off the top of my head, I can't think of something she could have done in the second half of the season to make her more relevant, but at the end of the day, that doesn't really matter at all to me that much because she didn't derail the second half of the show or anything. She just didn't have anything to do. I am more than pleased with the way Leia turned out in this series, and the young actress that was playing her did a fantastic job. Part 7. Other characters. Since I covered the 4 main characters, I wanted to touch on the other characters in this show briefly and talk about them. When it comes to the new characters in this series, none of them really stand out. Haja is a character that feels out of place in Star Wars. I don't know, maybe it was his Marvel-esque humor, but it didn't work for me. Roken was okay, I guess. They gave him a backstory about his wife being murdered by the Empire, but I completely forgot about that until right now. He's just a standard rebel character for me. I liked Tala quite a bit actually. I think she was probably the best of all the supporting characters, especially the ones that were new, but her death felt anticlimactic. I just didn't really care, and the scene treated her death more important than I felt it was. A theme of this show is that the writers struggle to flesh out new characters, but they do a fantastic job building upon the existing characters. Seeing Bail and Bria Organa in this series was great. We've seen Bail many times in Star Wars, but never as a father. The one scene where he was comforting Leia was a great moment and showed how awesome of a dad he was. One thing about Bail that kinda bothered me was the message he sent Obi-Wan in chapter 5. I get that he's a parent that hasn't heard from his daughter in days, but the message he sent and the words he used was incredibly reckless. I don't mind him sending a message. He's a worried father, so that makes sense. What bugged me was how he specifically mentioned the children and even mentioned Owen on Tatooine with the boy. I get narratively he needed to say that so Reva could get to Tatooine, but he should have used some code words or just been very vague with his message. If he hadn't heard from Obi-Wan in days, then there's a realistic chance that he got captured or killed. He should be aware of that and take better precautions not to put Leia or Luke in danger. Moving on though, I loved seeing Owen and Beru again, especially in the last episode. From A New Hope, we are kinda made to dislike Owen because he won't let Luke have fun and he won't let him join the academy. But here we get to see that Owen is a caring father and he treats Luke like one of his own. Also, Beru is pretty much a non-existent character in the movies, so seeing her be a badass bitch when defending her home against Reva was great. It's these little moments like Owen saying Luke is one of his own and Beru taking out the weapons and declaring they're defending their home that add to their character in a great way. When it comes to the Inquisitors, they didn't really do anything special. The fifth brother was kinda irrelevant in this entire series. I don't believe I actually saw him take out his lightsaber once. He just walked around and yelled at Reva. The Grand Inquisitor I felt was acted wonderfully by Rupert Friend. He added some personality to the character that was lacking from Star Wars Rebels. His fake out death was still fairly dumb, but it didn't bother me too much. Overall, the supporting characters in the series were a mixed bag. They did a great job at building upon the returning characters, but struggled to establish new ones. Part 8. Effect on the original trilogy. Every time a Star Wars story concludes, we often ask ourselves how it affects the wider Star Wars story. Sometimes you get stories like The Mandalorian Season 1, which have a minimal effect on the wider narrative. But considering Obi-Wan Kenobi features 3 of the most prominent characters in the Star Wars universe, this series is pretty important. So how does this show affect the original trilogy? The way it really does it is by adding context to certain lines of dialogue. And Star Wars isn't new to this. When the prequels came out, many lines from the original trilogy had new meaning. Like when Leia said she knew her real mother, but her real mother died when she was a minute old. The only real blatant retcon is when Obi-Wan tells Luke he hadn't heard the name Obi-Wan since before Luke was born. That is obviously no longer the case. But was that line really that important? No. For me, this series adds emotional weight to the original trilogy in almost every way. When Leia calls for Obi-Wan in the classic speech, it makes you think differently about the scene knowing what happened in this show. And the reason why Leia didn't mention their adventures together at all is because Obi-Wan asked her not to. This show also fixes a very minor plot hole. When Luke tells Leia Ben Kenobi is here, she says, "Ben Kenobi, where is he?" Like she knows who that is. But realistically, she would have no clue who Ben Kenobi is. Only Obi-Wan Kenobi. So that scene always felt weird. But now she knows who Ben Kenobi is, so this excitement that comes out of Leia makes sense. Another glaring way this series makes the original trilogy better is when Obi-Wan fights Vader again. If this was really the first time the two met after Mustafar, I imagine Obi-Wan would be a bit more emotional and actually call Vader Anakin. But since Obi-Wan already came to terms with his belief that Anakin is dead, it makes sense why he would call him Darth, because that was the last thing he called him in this series. Also, Obi-Wan sacrificed himself not only for Luke, but for Luke and Leia, which is neat. Some ask why didn't Leia mourn Obi-Wan at all if she knew him? Well, we didn't even see her mourn the destruction of her home planet and the death of her parents in that movie. So I don't think it's that ridiculous that we don't see her mourn a guy she only knew for a few days. I spoke about this before, but the show also makes that line where Darth Vader says, "Obi-Wan once thought as you do," make sense. Because before, Obi-Wan never thought there was good in Anakin, but we see that in this series. And the last thing I will mention is that it adds more weight to the notion that Leia would name her son Ben. Yes, this is a sequel trilogy thing, not an original trilogy thing, but I'm still gonna add it. Overall, I love the way this series added emotional weight to the original trilogy while barely taking anything away from it. Part 9. Rewriting Obi-Wan Kenobi. I'm gonna do something I've never done in these years later videos. I'm gonna add a section where I rewrite the entire series. If you have watched some of my other rewrites, like my Book of Boba Fett rewrite, then you should be familiar with how these usually go. When I do a Star Wars rewrite, my goal isn't to tell a completely new story that I would have liked to have seen. My goal is to take the ideas that are present in the current story and rewrite them into something I feel would be more effective. My version of the story has to begin and end in the same place as the current story. Now, I'm not saying I'm a better writer than the people who wrote this show, I'm definitely not. I just like tweaking stories into something I would have liked better and sharing it with you guys. So with my rewrite of Obi-Wan Kenobi, the general outline of what's going to happen is going to be the same as the current show. Leia getting captured is what's going to lure Obi-Wan out of hiding. Obi-Wan and Vader will fight each other again, twice, and yes, Reva will still be a part of the story. If I had to do a complete and total rewrite, I wouldn't include her, but again, my goal is to take the current story and make it better. Also, my rewrite will stick to the 6-episode format of the Disney Plus series, and yes, that includes the dreaded 4th episode. So yeah, those are the rules of my rewrite, if you will, for Obi-Wan Kenobi. Without further ado, let's begin. Episode 1. Episode 1 I felt was originally borderline perfect. So when it comes to the story beats of this episode, I'm not gonna change much. What I will change about this episode are certain things that are set up that will be paid off later on in the series. So to begin the series, I'm gonna keep the flashback on Coruscant where Order 66 begins. Reva will be training and she'll actually have a conversation that's brief with her master with the green lightsaber. Her master will say something like, "Good job, Reva," and something else like, "You will one day become a great Jedi. I am so proud of you." An aspect of the original opening from the show was that they kind of tried to hide the fact that this was Reva's backstory, and that in chapter 5, it was some sort of big reveal when we learned that Reva was one of those younglings. Anyone who has half a brain cell could have figured that out after the first episode ended when they realized one of the younglings was a black girl. So in my story, I'm gonna let audiences know that Reva was one of the younglings right away. During their training, the clones will come in and start shooting everyone just like they did in the show. But instead of cutting it off before anything actually happens, I'm gonna extend the scene and actually have it play out. So a young Reva and her fellow younglings will continue to run away, and boom, Anakin will show up. Anakin will murder most of the younglings, but Reva will start to run away. As Reva is kinda a safe distance away from Anakin, she will notice that pretty much all of her friends are dead and that Anakin murdered her master. As Reva is watching this happen, she will get shot by a clone and lay on the ground. The camera will pan up and transition right away to Reva in the present. She will be on the transport like the regular scene begins, and then it will transition to the people on Tatooine and the scene will play out the exact same way. The Grand Inquisitor shows up, they find one of the Jedi named Nari, he escapes, and the Grand Inquisitor will tell Reva to stop fixating on Kenobi. One thing I will change though is that Nari won't get away so easily. In the current show, they make no effort to stop him. Maybe there's like a 20-second chase sequence where the Inquisitors actually make an effort to capture him and they manage to lose him in the process. Then we transition to Obi-Wan Kenobi working at his day job, and a good portion of the rest of the episode will play out pretty much the exact same way. We will see Obi-Wan talking to the Jawas, we will see him having nightmares, we will see him argue with Owen, Reva will still interrogate Owen before she leaves, Obi-Wan will still run into Nari in the desert. All of that plays out the same way. The reason why I love most of this stuff is because it shows Obi-Wan's trauma perfectly. We see how depressed he is, we see how hopeless he is, and we see how he's a shell of the man he was before. I guess a minor change I will include is adding a line when Obi-Wan is talking to Nari, and he'll say something like, "What makes you think I can restart the Jedi Order?" The purpose of this is because one aspect of Obi-Wan's arc I really want to emphasize is that he thinks he's a failure and that he doesn't trust himself. The show already does that, but I want to emphasize it even more. We are introduced to Leia, and pretty much every scene with her plays out the exact same way, except for that dumbass chase scene. When she walks outside, those bandits are just gonna capture her right away. No chase in the forest, thank God. The scenes with Leia in this episode do a fantastic job at making her feel like Princess Leia, especially when she roasts the shit out of her cousin. So I want to keep all of that. We transition back to Obi-Wan. Bail and his wife ask Obi-Wan to help find her, and just like the show, he rejects. One scene I'm actually gonna cut out is the moment where Obi-Wan finds Nari dead. This scene was pretty powerful, but in a few episodes you'll realize why I want to cut out this scene. Obi-Wan goes through his daily job, returns home, and Bail Organa is there. They have the same conversation as before, but again, it's emphasized how much of a failure Obi-Wan thinks he is. Obi-Wan will say something like, "Had I not gone to Utapau, maybe I could have saved him before he went to the dark side." Obi-Wan believes that he is the sole reason why Anakin turned to the dark side. This adds a lot more guilt on his shoulders. Bail will still convince him to leave, and he will. The rest of the episode plays out the exact same same way, and it ends with Obi-Wan leaving Tatooine. The purpose of this episode was to flesh out Obi-Wan's trauma and give Reva a different backstory, which she'll get more pieces of later on. The episode already does a great job at showing Obi-Wan's trauma, so I didn't need to change much. And that is episode 1, on to episode 2. Episode 2. Episode 2 is also going to be mostly the same. I felt from a narrative perspective, this episode was good. The problem I had with episode 2 was the execution of a lot of it. The moments where Reva is hopping on the roofs is kinda cringe. Leia running away from Obi-Wan I also felt was really dumb, and some of the action was just not that exciting. Since this is a rewrite, I'm not here to change the directing and the acting of the series. All I can say really are things like this will be done better. The action when Obi-Wan saves Leia will be done better. Haja's character will be mostly the same, but he'll have humor that feels more like Star Wars. I know this is a cop-out, but again, I'm simply rewriting the series, not redirecting everything. I don't know how to direct action, so all I can say is that it will be done better. So we'll still get the great moments between Leia and Obi-Wan, we'll still get the infighting of the Inquisitors, we'll also keep other great moments like where Obi-Wan finds the clone and when he runs into this drug dealer girl. I'm gonna get rid of the part where Leia runs away. Instead, that whole chase scene can simply be Leia and Obi-Wan running away from the bounty hunters, kind of like how they currently are. And instead of Leia jumping off the roof like an idiot, at one point she'll accidentally fall off and we'll get the moment where Obi-Wan uses the Force for the first time to save her. They'll get to the spaceport, Obi-Wan will still tell Leia that she reminds him of his old friend who we know is Padme, and then Reva will show up. Once Reva shows up, then the episode will be a little different. Obi-Wan will tell Leia to go to the transport, and then he will walk out and face Reva. The two have a conversation, and in that conversation, you will really get the vibe that Reva hates Obi-Wan. She says things like, "I'm gonna kill you," and typical dark side jargon. Obi-Wan will take out his lightsaber and the two will fight. Obi-Wan won't beat her because he's still rusty and this is the first time he's using a lightsaber in so long, but he also won't lose the fight. The transport starts to leave, and Obi-Wan will run away and hop on it and escape before Reva will catch up. I didn't really change much as I did remove stuff. The Grand Inquisitor isn't gonna show up and get stabbed like an idiot, but most importantly, Reva isn't gonna tell Obi-Wan that Anakin is alive. I'm gonna save that moment where Obi-Wan finds out in chapter 3. So Obi-Wan escapes after barely holding his own, and then Reva will say something on the comms like, "Inform Lord Vader that we have found Obi-Wan Kenobi, inform him that he is alive." And then we'll transition into the ending shot where we see Vader and the episode ends. So with the episode, I didn't change much. I just removed the dumbass chase scene, the Grand Inquisitor, fake out death, and the reveal that Anakin is alive. Let's move on to episode 3. Episode 3. For the first 2/3 of the episode, most of it is going to be a mix of it being the same story while incorporating new elements. The story that actually happens is going to be pretty much the exact same. Vader will talk to Reva about Obi-Wan being alive, except there won't be any talk about her becoming Grand Inquisitor because that's not going to be a plot point in my show. Obi-Wan and Leia will arrive on the planet, and pretty much everything up until the point where Vader shows up on the planet is going to be the same. I guess I'll change minor things like the part where Obi-Wan and Leia simply don't walk around the gate, but overall the narrative beats of the first 2/3 of this episode work for me. I liked seeing this one truck driver who's in favor of the Empire. I liked seeing the stormtroopers talk to Obi-Wan and where he almost slips. I love seeing Leia ask Obi-Wan about her parents and where he talks about his family. All of that is going to be the same. Now, as this stuff is happening, we are going to cut back and forth to flashbacks with Anakin and Obi-Wan, but it's not going to be the same flashbacks that we got in the current episode 5. One quick notable change will be that Anakin and Obi-Wan will be de-aged, unlike the current show. So throughout episode 3, the current story will cut back and forth to flashbacks of Anakin and Obi-Wan during the Clone Wars, but they're on the same planet that Leia and Obi-Wan are currently on. Obi-Wan in the current show tells Leia that there used to be a bunch of families and farmers that are gone because of the Empire. So in the flashbacks, we will see Anakin and Obi-Wan help all these people living on these farms. During these flashbacks, we will get to see how great of a person Anakin is. He's kind to people, he's helping them out, and he's doing a great job of being a leader. Every time there's a flashback of Anakin doing something noble, we'll also see Leia doing something fairly similar. I want to emphasize a connection in this episode that Leia and Anakin are very similar people. They are both a bit hot-headed and stubborn, but they love helping people and doing what's right. So throughout this episode, you can add little moments where Leia does some noble things like helping someone, and then it cuts to the flashback of Anakin helping someone too. This is going going to be a crucial part of Obi-Wan's arc that was kinda hinted at in the show, but not executed on enough. Obi-Wan firmly believes that he is the sole reason why Anakin turned evil. This is what he said to Bail in my rewrite. When he sees Leia doing things fairly similar to what Anakin did, he starts to slowly remember how great of a person Anakin was. This will be crucial in the climax of Obi-Wan's arc in Chapter 6. So the episode will play out pretty much the exact same way until Vader shows up. Vader shows up and Obi-Wan senses him, but remember, since Obi-Wan didn't find out Anakin was alive before, this is the moment where he finds out. He says some things to himself like Anakin because he feels Anakin's presence. He looks outside and sees Vader. Vader will sense Obi-Wan and will start killing civilians like he currently does. Oh, and by the way, one of the flashbacks we will see is Anakin helping the people of this village. So when we see Vader in the present killing all of them, it shows the stark contrast between Anakin and Darth Vader. Obi-Wan tells Tala that he needs to go see something and tells her to protect Leia. Obi-Wan needs to go see if that is really Anakin Skywalker. So he leaves and then runs into Vader on the top of the hill. Obi-Wan is mortified at what he is seeing, and he will say, "Anakin?" asking Vader if that is really him. Vader will say, "Anakin Skywalker is gone, only I am what remains." Then Obi-Wan will say, "What have you become?" and Vader will still say, "I am what you made me." You get a sense that this drives home Obi-Wan's guilt, and that he feels solely responsible for Anakin's fall. The two fight, and that pretty much plays out the same way. Vader kicks his ass, and Obi-Wan gets burned. Tala will shoot the rocks, and there will be an explosion. This is where the episode will radically change. The episode will mildly harm Vader. Maybe his suit gets partially damaged or something. But the fire isn't too big, and the stormtroopers will run around and capture Obi-Wan. That is right, Obi-Wan is going to get captured at the end of episode 3, not Leia. Leia and Tala will get to the spaceport after Tala shoots the rocks, and they will leave. Leia is upset that Obi-Wan was left behind, and Obi-Wan is in the hands of the Empire. Reva doesn't really do much in this episode, so she's kinda in the background for most of it. And that is episode 3. I changed quite a bit, especially the ending, but as you'll see in a sec, my changes are going to affect episode 4 greatly. Episode 4. So as you can probably tell, episode 4 is going to be pretty different. Obi-Wan is going to be taken to the Fortress Inquisitorius and put into one of the interrogation chairs. Vader, having been partially damaged and injured, will go to Mustafar to heal. In the current chapter 4, there's no logical reason why Vader shouldn't be at the Fortress Inquisitorius, so in my rewrite, I'm going to give a reason why he's not there, and that's because he's mildly injured. Cutting back to the other half of the story, Leia and Tala will arrive on Jabim. They tell Roken what happened, and Roken is upset. But here is the next major change. Nari from the first episode is going to show up. That's right, he made his way from Tatooine to this planet because he did mention that he knew a path for Jedi to survive. The reason why we never saw his death in my episode 1 is because he's still alive. Tala will say something about taking Leia back to Alderaan, but Leia will be stubborn and say, "I'm not leaving without Obi-Wan." Nari will suggest a rescue plan, and he will mention how he saw how great of a Jedi Obi-Wan was during the Clone Wars. He knows how great of a leader and person Obi-Wan was, and he feels he owes it to Obi-Wan to try and rescue him. He also wants to help Obi-Wan find his way again after seeing how depressed he was in chapter 1. So they pretty much orchestrate the same plan as the current chapter 4, but instead of Obi-Wan and Tala going, it's going to be Nari and Tala. So a good portion of the episode will play out the same way. Again, except with Nari instead of Obi-Wan. Tala will pretend to be an officer and find the location of Obi-Wan. Nari will enter through the water and we'll see him get some lightsaber action. As this is all happening, Reva will be interrogating Obi-Wan. Again, we'll get a strong sense that Reva hates Obi-Wan with a passion, and she'll even say something like, "If it weren't for Vader's orders to keep you alive, I would have killed you by now." Obi-Wan asks Reva why she hates him so much, and here is where we get the rest of the backstory to Reva. After Reva was shot on the ground in the opening of the series, well, she clearly survived. She's laying on the ground, barely able to move. It is day now, and in the distance, she sees Obi-Wan and Yoda walking through the temple. Remember, in Revenge of the Sith, Obi-Wan and Yoda go back to the temple and it's mostly empty. An injured Reva tries to call out for Obi-Wan and Yoda's help, but since she's so injured, she can't scream at all or move all that much. I should also mention that Reva is kind of far away from Obi-Wan and Yoda, so it's not like they walked right past her. The point is she's far enough to notice Obi-Wan and Yoda, but also far enough to where they can't easily see her. Obi-Wan and Yoda will fail to notice the injured Reva, and they leave the temple with Reva still there. The reason I wanted to add this was because it gives Reva a personal reason to hate Obi-Wan and want to find him. She doesn't want to find Obi-Wan simply for revenge against Vader. She wants to find him because she hates him. She feels like Obi-Wan left her at the temple to die. Now, of course, from Obi-Wan's perspective, he just never noticed her. But Reva was an injured kid about to die at the time. She doesn't realize that. Reva tells Obi-Wan this, and she says, "You left me there to die, and look what I became." She also mentions that she still wants to kill Vader because Vader was the one that killed all of her friends and her master at the temple. Obi-Wan apologizes, but Reva doesn't care. Reva has to leave to go talk to Tala, and as this happens, Nari shows up and saves Obi-Wan. The two escape and meet up with Tala after she leaves Reva. Along the way, they can still find the Jedi tomb. That wasn't an important scene, but it was still cool. The three of them find officer disguises and are about to leave. Since Leia isn't here, there's no dumb moment where we see Obi-Wan hide her in his coat. As they're about to escape, Reva shows up and confronts the three of them. Nari takes out his lightsaber and starts to fight Reva. As this is happening, Obi-Wan and Tala get to the snowspeeder that comes to rescue them. But as that happens, Reva bests Nari and kills him. Obi-Wan is devastated to see Nari die, and the two manage to escape the planet and leave. There can be a quick moment where Reva throws a tracker on the ship quickly before the ship leaves the planet. And from that point, the episode pretty much ends the same way. The changes I made to episode 4, I felt made the episode far more compelling. There's an emotional death scene where Nari sacrifices himself to save Obi-Wan. We get a powerful backstory to Reva, and the beat of Obi-Wan having to save Leia isn't repeated for the second time in the series. Episode 5. Episode 5 is pretty much going to be the exact same story with minor changes. When Obi-Wan and Tala get back to Jabim, Leia is happy to see Obi-Wan, but Obi-Wan is upset that Nari died. Obi-Wan meets Roken, and Roken tells Obi-Wan how Leia wouldn't leave until she knew Obi-Wan was safe. Roken also tells Obi-Wan how Nari led the plan to save him, and that he did it because of how much he admired Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan is moved by this, and the thought of Nari giving his life to save him is what causes Obi-Wan to start to change. We start to see him become his old self again, because if Nari gave his life to save a great Jedi, then Obi-Wan feels he owes it to Nari to be that great Jedi. Again, as I stated before, the rest of the episode is going to play out the exact same way. We'll see Anakin and Obi-Wan train in a flashback, except it will be Revenge of the Sith Anakin. This way it feels more in line with the flashbacks we saw in Chapter 3. And then the siege of Jabim will begin. There won't be a key revelation about Reva's backstory because that happened in my episode 4. I don't want to change much from this episode narratively because I liked this episode. Where this episode definitely struggled again was with the directing and the way the entire episode was shot. Again, since this is a rewrite and not a refilming of the series, I'm just gonna say these moments were filmed better. No shaky cam, just good visual storytelling. Tala will still die, Leia will still work with the wires to open the gate, Obi-Wan will still accidentally leave Bail's message behind, and Vader will still have that cool moment where he force pulls the transport. Now, for the longest time, I tried to figure out a way for Vader to still fight Reva and have her be injured but not die, and to have it not be kinda dumb like in the current episode. I sat here for hours and I just couldn't think of something. I guess instead of Vader stabbing Reva through the stomach, she will get sliced in the back or something to where Vader thinks she is dead instantly. You can still have the flashbacks too where we see Anakin killing a bunch of kids, except this time there won't be a flashback of her being stabbed because that never happened in my story. It's not ideal, but I'm gonna stick with the story beat that Vader will think he killed Reva, but he didn't. As Reva is crawling around on the ground, she will find Bail's message. The only thing that will change about this ending is that she will see a small transport in the distance of the base. This way, when she shows up on Tatooine in the last episode, people don't question how she got there. And that is how episode 5 will end. Episode 6. Episode 6, similarly to episode 5, will play out pretty much the exact same way. The only things that are going to change are what's said during certain scenes. When Obi-Wan is about to leave the transport in the beginning of the episode, Roken and all the others will thank Obi-Wan for all his help. Roken will say something along the lines of, "You inspired us all, you are a great Jedi, and we have you to thank for all of our lives." This will mean a lot to Obi-Wan. When Obi-Wan fights Vader, the fight will pretty much play out the exact same way. When Obi-Wan is buried under the rocks, he will not only think about Leia and Luke, but also Nari and Anakin. He will think about how even though he may have failed Anakin, he had succeeded in helping so many others. He will also think about all the good that Anakin has done and remind himself that he did good with Anakin. So they continue to fight, Vader's mask gets broken, and the two talk. Obi-Wan will apologize like he currently does, Vader will say, "I am not your failure, and I killed Anakin Skywalker." And this is where I'm gonna add some new dialogue. Obi-Wan will say to Vader, "Anakin Skywalker was a great great man, a great leader, and a great friend. I may have made mistakes with him that led him to the dark side, but what he became is not my fault. I don't know if this is a controversial take or not, but I strongly disagree with the notion that Obi-Wan should receive most of the blame for Anakin's fall. Sure, Obi-Wan made decisions that led to Anakin's fall, but it's ridiculous to put most of the blame on him. Obi-Wan did nothing but train a good man, and we see how good of a person and how good of a Jedi Anakin was during the Clone Wars. There are only two people that should hold the vast majority of the blame for Anakin's fall: Palpatine and Anakin himself. Putting most of the blame on Obi-Wan is like putting most of the blame on Padme because she was the one who fell in love with Anakin, even though that's not allowed. So what I wanted for Obi-Wan to go through in this series is coming to terms with the mistakes he made with Anakin, but also realizing that he is not at fault for what Anakin became. Throughout the series, he sees the good he inspired in Leia, Nari, Roken, and some of the other partisans. Seeing Leia remind himself of all the good in Anakin allows Obi-Wan to remember all the right he did with Anakin. Oftentimes, when people are riddled with guilt, they beat themselves up more than they probably should. I kinda feel the same way with Obi-Wan and Anakin. So Obi-Wan apologizing to Anakin while also admitting to himself it is not his fault, I feel is a powerful arc for Obi-Wan to go on. To continue on, Obi-Wan will say goodbye Darth and return to Tatooine. What happens to Reva is going to be mostly the same, except the moment where Reva is about to strike down Luke. As this is happening, Obi-Wan will show up and talk to Reva. This version of Reva is not trying to kill Luke to get back at Vader, but to get to Obi-Wan. She realizes that Luke must matter a lot to Obi-Wan because of that message. So if she kills Luke, then she will hurt Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan calms down Reva and tells her that she doesn't need to do this, and that she doesn't need to become the same person as Darth Vader. After she realizes this is when she breaks down into tears and apologizes. What this changes to the story is that Obi-Wan is directly responsible for stopping Reva, and he does it in a Jedi way. Obi-Wan acts like the great Jedi he is and is able to empathize with Reva and stop her from killing Luke. Had Obi-Wan never gone on this arc of reminding himself how great of a Jedi he was, then he wouldn't have had the wisdom to stop Reva. I think what this change does is make the climax of Reva's story tie directly into Obi-Wan's story, which wasn't the case before. Obi-Wan lets Reva live, and the rest of the episode plays out the exact same way as it did before. And that is my rewrite of Obi-Wan Kenobi. Do you guys like my changes, or do you think the story is just as good as it was before? Let me know down below. Part 10, in conclusion. What are my final thoughts on this series? Overall, I'm mostly pleased. I think this show told a compelling story that just faltered a lot with its execution. But after seeing this show in its entirety, I can confidently say that this story should have been a movie. This show had a lot of fluff that wasn't necessary to it. Had it been a movie, then the storytellers would be forced to cut some of that out. Also, a big problem with this series that a lot of people had was that it felt cheap. The sets were unimaginative, and the cinematography felt like a fan film at times. Had this been a $200 million movie, then this would most likely not be a problem. But with this season over, it begs the question if there should be a season 2. Frankly, I don't want one. I think it cheapens Obi-Wan's story if we keep seeing him go on adventures and leave Tatooine. Now, if he has a story where he stays on Tatooine and spends some time training with Qui-Gon, I guess that could be interesting. But if season 2 were to have Obi-Wan stay on Tatooine, then it would automatically pale in comparison to season 1. Now, if there is a season 2, Vader cannot be in it at all. We cannot have another encounter between Vader and Obi-Wan, especially since the way season 1 ended. I've warmed up a little bit to the idea of a season 2, but I'd still prefer it not happen. But with season 1, if I had to give it a final score, I would probably give it a 7.5 out of 10. The story was mostly great, and I appreciated most of the characters, but the execution was not great in a lot of aspects, and the overall production value of the show felt cheap, which takes away from the Star Wars experience. And those are my thoughts on Obi-Wan Kenobi. Thank you everyone so much for watching another one of my videos. Don't forget to unite the Claude Squad, and I will see you guys next time.